5 men left a basketball game on a Friday night. They drove into the mountains. They parked their car. And then they walked away from it. Into the snow. Into the dark. Toward nothing that made sense. One man was never found. On the evening of February 24, 1978, 5 men from Yuba City, California attended a college basketball game at California State University, Chico. They were not students. They were not strangers to one another. They were close friends. Their names were Gary Mathias, Jack Hewitt, William Sterling, Ted Weiher, and Jack Madruga. All 5 had mild intellectual disabilities. Some lived independently. Others lived with family. They worked jobs. They had routines. They were known in their community as reliable, punctual, and careful. That night, the basketball game was a highlight. They cheered. They socialized. They bought snacks on the way out. Witnesses later described them as being in good spirits. Nothing about the evening felt unusual. At around 10 p.m., the group left Chico in Jack Madruga's car. Their plan was simple: drive south, return home, go to bed. They never arrived. The next morning, families began to worry. Jack Madruga failed to show up for work. That was immediately alarming. He had never missed a shift without calling. Phone calls were made. Friends were contacted. No one had heard from any of the 5 men. By midday, concern turned into fear. That evening, the Yuba County Sheriff's Department received multiple missing person reports. The 5 men had vanished together. At first, investigators assumed the car had broken down somewhere between Chico and Yuba City. Search teams were sent along the expected route. Roads were checked. Gas stations were questioned. Nothing was found. 2 days later, the case took an unexpected turn. On February 26th, a man driving through the mountains near Oroville noticed a car parked along a remote forest road. It was partially buried in snow. The location made no sense. This road was not on the route home. It was more than 70 miles in the wrong direction. The car was identified as Jack Madruga's. It was unlocked. The keys were missing. There was no visible damage. The gas tank was nearly full. The engine was functional. The car was not stuck. Investigators later confirmed that the vehicle could have been driven out of its position with minimal effort. There were no signs of a struggle. No blood. No evidence of foul play. The 5 men had simply left the car. On foot. In the mountains. At night. In winter. This single decision would become the most haunting aspect of the case. Why would 5 men abandon a perfectly functional car in freezing conditions? There was no storm that night. Temperatures were cold, but not extreme. The road was unfamiliar, but not impassable. The men were dressed lightly. Some were wearing thin jackets. None were dressed for snow travel. Yet they walked away. Search teams were dispatched immediately. Hundreds of volunteers combed the area. Helicopters searched from above. Dogs were brought in. Tracks were found in the snow. Footprints. 5 sets. They led away from the car. Upward. Into deeper terrain. The tracks showed no signs of panic. No running. No disorder. The men appeared to be walking calmly, together. After a short distance, the tracks became difficult to follow. Snowfall covered parts of the trail. Searchers lost the path. Days turned into weeks. Winter conditions worsened. The case stalled. As time passed, investigators began to examine the personal backgrounds of the men more closely. One detail stood out. Gary Mathias. Gary was different from the others. He was the only one diagnosed with schizophrenia. He had served briefly in the U.S. Army. He was physically stronger, more independent. He sometimes acted as a leader within the group. At the time of the disappearance, Gary had stopped taking his prescribed medication. Some investigators wondered if he had influenced the group's decisions that night. Perhaps he believed something was wrong. Perhaps he convinced the others to follow him. But this theory raised as many questions as it answered. Gary was known to be protective of his friends. Not reckless, not cruel. He had navigated episodes before without putting others in danger. And even if Gary had been experiencing symptoms, why would the others follow him into the mountains? Months passed. Then, in June of 1978, nearly 4 months after the disappearance, a motorcycle rider exploring the forest stumbled upon something shocking. A body. It belonged to Ted Weiher. Ted was found inside a U.S. Forest Service trailer, located more than 20 miles from where the car had been abandoned. The trailer was meant to serve as emergency shelter. It contained food, fuel, blankets, heating equipment. Ted had not frozen to death immediately. Evidence suggested he had survived for weeks, possibly months. He was wrapped in blankets. His beard had grown long. He had lost significant weight. The cause of death was starvation. This discovery changed everything. Inside the trailer, investigators found canned food. Enough food to last a year. The cans were unopened. Nearby, a storage shed contained supplies that could have saved all 5 men. They were untouched. Ted had died slowly, surrounded by resources he did not use. Search teams expanded their efforts. Soon after, 4 sets of remains were found in the surrounding area. William Sterling and Jack Hewitt were discovered along the trail leading from the car toward the trailer. They had died of exposure. Jack Madruga was found further away, also dead from hypothermia. Gary Mathias was never found. No body, no clothing, no remains. He vanished completely. By the end of 1978, the official investigation concluded. The deaths were ruled accidental. Exposure. Starvation. No foul play suspected. But for many, the explanation felt hollow. Why abandon the car? Why walk uphill? Why ignore shelter and food? Why survive for weeks without opening cans? Why did one man disappear entirely? The case became known as the Yuba County Five, and it refused to fade. As investigators pieced together the timeline, the mystery deepened rather than clarified. Every new detail seemed to contradict common sense. The men had not acted as anyone expected them to act when lost, cold, and in danger. The path they chose was the first major problem. From the abandoned car, the 5 men had walked uphill into increasingly difficult terrain. The trail led away from the nearest town, away from lights, and away from help. Searchers later confirmed that had they walked downhill instead, they would have reached a small settlement within a few hours. Instead, they climbed. Footprints showed they stayed together for a significant distance. No one lagged behind. No one turned back. This was not a moment of panic or confusion. It appeared deliberate. Investigators struggled to explain this choice. Some suggested the men believed they were heading toward a familiar landmark. Others believed they were following Gary Mathias, trusting him to lead. But none of the 5 had any known reason to be in that area. None were familiar with the mountain roads, and none had expressed interest in hiking or camping. The night was cold. Snow covered the ground. Visibility was limited, yet they continued. The discovery of Ted Weiher inside the Forest Service trailer introduced a new layer of questions. The trailer was stocked with survival supplies. There were cases of military-style rations, canned food, a propane tank, matches, a heating system that could be activated with minimal effort. Ted had not used them. Instead of opening cans, he had eaten small amounts of food found in his pockets. He had lost more than 100 pounds. He had survived long enough for his beard to grow and for his body to weaken slowly. Why? Investigators believed Ted may not have known how to operate the heater or open the cans. But this explanation fell apart quickly. The cans were standard, easily opened with the provided tools. The heater instructions were simple. Ted was known to follow instructions well. More troubling was the condition of his feet. Ted's shoes were missing. His feet showed signs of severe frostbite. Yet inside the trailer, investigators found shoes that belonged to another member of the group. This suggested the men had reached the trailer together, at least at first. Evidence pointed to the possibility that all 5 men made it to the trailer, or at least very close to it. If that was true, then what happened next was even harder to understand. Why did some leave the shelter? Why did others die outside? Why did no one fully use the supplies? The bodies of William Sterling and Jack Hewitt were found along the trail leading from the car to the trailer. Their locations suggested they had collapsed from exposure. There were no signs of injury, no evidence of violence. Jack Madruga's body was found farther away, near where the car had been abandoned. He appeared to have turned back at some point. Why he separated from the others was never explained. This meant the group had fractured, not all at once, but slowly. Then there was Gary Mathias. Gary was the strongest, the most capable, the one most likely to survive. Yet he was the only one never found. No remains, no clothing, no trace. Some believed Gary had survived and escaped the mountains. Others believed his remains were simply never located. The terrain was vast, dense forest, deep snow, but search teams had covered the area extensively. Gary's disappearance remained absolute. Psychologists were consulted to explain the group's behavior. One theory focused on groupthink, the idea that individuals defer to a perceived leader even when decisions are irrational. If Gary believed they were heading in the right direction, the others may have followed without question. Another theory involved fear. Perhaps the men believed someone was after them. Perhaps they misinterpreted something they saw on the road. A strange vehicle. A perceived threat. Panic does not always look chaotic. Sometimes it looks calm, determined, and wrong. But no evidence supported this. There were no reports of suspicious activity that night. No witnesses. No known enemies. A more controversial theory suggested that Gary Mathias experienced a severe psychotic episode. Untreated schizophrenia can cause paranoia, hallucinations, and distorted judgment. If Gary believed they were in danger, he may have convinced the others to abandon the car. But again, this theory had limits. Gary had experienced episodes before. He had never led anyone into harm. He was described as caring and responsible. And even if he had been symptomatic, why would the others follow him so far? Families struggled to accept the official explanation. Parents questioned how their sons could starve next to food, how they could freeze near shelter, how one could vanish entirely. The men were not reckless. They were not uneducated. They were not incapable of basic survival. Something interrupted normal decision-making. Something changed their behavior. Over time, the Yuba County Five became known as the American Dyatlov Pass, not because the cases were identical, but because both involved groups making inexplicable choices in harsh environments. In both cases, the lack of violence was unsettling. No struggle, no fight, just absence. Decades later, the case remains officially closed. No new evidence has emerged. No final answers were found. The questions remain suspended in time. Why did they leave the car? Why did they go uphill? Why did they not use what could save them? And where did Gary Mathias go? As the years passed, the Yuba County Five slowly transformed from a missing persons case into something more unsettling. Not because new evidence emerged, but because none ever did. The facts stayed fixed. The questions did not. Investigators eventually accepted that there was no single moment where everything went wrong. Instead, the case appeared to unravel through a series of small, irreversible decisions. Each choice made the next one worse. The men did not panic in the way people expect panic to look. There was no chaos, no running, no scattered belongings. Everything suggested calm movement, purposeful steps, a shared belief that they were doing the right thing. That belief may have been the most dangerous factor of all. One theory that gained traction over time focused on misinterpretation. Investigators speculated that the men may have believed they were heading toward a familiar location. In the dark, surrounded by snow, landmarks can become meaningless. Roads curve. Shadows distort distance. What feels like the correct direction can quietly lead deeper into isolation. Another theory suggested authority confusion. Some of the men were known to follow rules rigidly. If they believed they were not allowed to use the Forest Service trailer or its supplies, they may have hesitated. This could explain why food remained unopened and equipment unused. But this theory also struggled. The men were starving, freezing, dying. Rules tend to break down under those conditions. Yet, here, they did not. Gary Mathias remained the most complex element of the case. Some believed Gary survived the initial ordeal. He was physically capable. He knew the terrain better than the others. He may have left the trailer to seek help or supplies. If so, he never returned. Others believed Gary died somewhere beyond the search area. His remains may still lie undiscovered in the mountains. Snow, animals, and time can erase almost everything. But for families, this explanation was difficult to accept. Gary's disappearance felt different, final. There were rumors, too. Unconfirmed sightings. Stories of a man matching Gary's description seen in nearby towns. Claims that he had been spotted hitchhiking. None were substantiated. None led anywhere. The possibility that Gary walked away and lived out his life elsewhere remained, but it rested on speculation alone. No bank records, no employment history, no confirmed identity. Nothing. As official interest faded, the case lived on through quiet retellings. Local residents, search volunteers, family members who replayed the timeline endlessly, searching for a point where something could have been done differently. The men had been so close to survival. That was the hardest part. Shelter existed. Food existed. Warmth existed. And yet, they died. Psychologists revisiting the case decades later offered a broader explanation. Not one rooted in pathology, but in vulnerability. The men trusted one another deeply. They were a group that moved together, made decisions together, and relied on one another. That bond, usually a strength, may have become a liability under stress. No one broke away. No one challenged the group's direction. No one said, "This is wrong." When the group fractured, it did so quietly. One fell behind. Another turned back. Another stayed. Not through argument, but exhaustion. By the time Ted Weiher was alone in the trailer, the others were already gone. The final moments inside the trailer remain especially haunting. Ted did not die quickly. He survived long enough to grow a beard, long enough to lose significant weight, long enough to experience hunger so severe it would have been unbearable. And still, the food remained unopened. This detail alone ensured the case would never feel resolved. The official explanation remained unchanged. Accidental deaths due to exposure and starvation. No foul play. No criminal responsibility. But the lack of violence did not make the story less disturbing. If anything, it made it worse. There was no villain to blame, no clear mistake to point to, just a slow drift into catastrophe. Today, the Yuba County Five are remembered not for how they died, but for how they moved. Together, calmly, in the wrong direction. Their story is often compared to other unexplained group tragedies, but it stands apart in one crucial way. There was no sudden disaster, no avalanche, no visible threat, only choices and silence. The mountains where they walked remain unchanged. Snow still covers the roads in winter. Trails still vanish into trees. The Forest Service trailer still exists, a quiet structure holding echoes of questions that will never be answered. Why did they leave the car? Why did they go uphill? Why did they not use what could save them? And why did one man vanish completely? The Yuba County Five did not disappear all at once. They disappeared step by step. And somewhere between those steps, the truth slipped away.